345 to 353, where he brings up the notion of reflection and then talks about it in these three forms. So as I just said before the break, right, to say that essence is reflection is not to speak of reflection as we traditionally do, that is as a mental operation, as the pathway of knowledge. Rather, in the science of logic, so every time you see him say reflection here, don't think mental process, think ontological process. So he defines reflection in this way on 346. In the middle of 346, he's giving a definition of reflection there. He says, this is the first full paragraph down. In essence, therefore, the becoming. Everybody see where I'm at? In essence, therefore, the becoming. In essence, therefore, becoming, the reflective movement of essence. So notice he's just putting this all together now, right? So reflection names neither shine nor essence, but the reflective becoming, right, of essence, reflection, is therefore the movement from nothing to nothing and thereby back to itself. Here's one of the definitions people always go, well, that sounds like a tautology, moving from nothing to nothing. But it's actually moving from nothing, from shine, from the lack, to nothing, which is essence, the negation of that lack, and thereby back to itself. It comes to be itself, right? Reflection is this relationship, what he initially called relativity. He's now calling reflection. That's the relation between essence and being. So in the logic of being, whether we're speaking of quantitative, qualitative, or measuring determinacy, being is always negated by a limit. It is always something and other. In the logic of being, he always said it's being with non-being, being with non-being. The limit, as we saw, necessarily becomes a restriction, and in both qualitative and quantitative determinacy, it's true in measure as well, this relationship of being and limit, reality and negation, or discreteness and continuity, causes each form of determinacy to become infinitely altering. In the logic of being, then, being is primary, and it secondarily bears a relation to an other. This is what he says on 345, 3 lines up from the bottom, right? It bears a relationship to the other in the logic of being. Therefore, what we might call the openness of this relation to another, reality is open to negation, continuity is open to discreteness, is what drives the logic of being, both in terms of qualitative determinacy and quantitative determinacy, and that ultimately results in measure being measureless. Right? That's what's going on. In the logic of essence, by contrast, he says there, this is again on 345, 2 lines up from the bottom. In the logic of essence, by contrast, the otherness, the alterity, the negation at issue is not open. It's not just with non-being, right? But is, quote, negation in itself, a negation that has being only as self-relating. So here we're not talking about being with non-being, we're talking about negation being the principal thing we're talking about. He's saying that's what reflection is. Reflection is this operation, this movement, this process of negation, determinate negation. And Hegel explains that this means that being here, in essence, is not being with a non-being, but being is negation itself. That is, anything that is, that exists, is real, it's discrete, only is insofar as it is negated. Being is thus shine. Shine is negation as negation, negation with its very negativity on display. So Hegel concludes that being as shine in the logic of essence is not a first immediacy that passes over into its negation. He says this on 346, 7 lines from the top. As reality becomes or passes over into negation, discreteness passes over or becomes continuity, measure becomes or passes over into measurelessness. Rather, as shine, being is nothing other than negation itself, and this means that it is dependent for itself on that which is other than itself. It is dependent on essence. So there's a dependency relationship between shine and essence. Hence, the constitutive movement here is not that of becoming qua passing over, Übergehen, which is really what the entirety of the logic of being was about. Something passes over into other, continuity passes over into discreteness, this measure passes over into the measurelessness. Right? It's not the becoming or passing over, but reflection, it's reflection here, is the positing of being qua shine, so being as shine, that ties it, being, back to and anchors it in essence. So reflection names the process, you could say names the relation and names the process, that holds together and constitutes both being as shine and essence itself, because it being as essence. So that's why he says you have this movement back to itself. Negation never got back to itself really completely in the logic of being. It does here in the logic of essence. So reflection is the constitutive process whereby shine and essence are related precisely because being itself proved to be self-negating. Reflection then is the ontological process whereby being shines, whereby all that is, and essence reflects, posits being as what it is, namely it posits being as shine, posits as negation. Hence, reflection moves from negation, from shine, and in negating this negation, it posits essence, it moves to nothing, external reflection as we're about to call it, and thereby reflection comes into its own, returns to itself, becomes, as Hegel will call it, self-determining, determining reflection. So I think the best way to read this discussion he's now about to enter into with this notion of positing, extrinsic or external, and determining reflection is think about it this way. We entered this discussion of the doctrine of essence first talking about what is being under the doctrine of essence. Being is shine. It bears a relationship to essence. What is that relation? Reflection. So he's focused in now on the reflective process that constitutes both being as shine and being as essence. That's what he's focused on. And he's asking this question. What is the structure of that process? What's its law of governance? That's what I mean by structure. What's its law of governance? And that's why he goes to these three forms of reflection. What they are, positing, extrinsic, and determining reflection, are all ways of understanding, ultimately, and determining reflection, understanding it comprehensively and fully. But all of them are the basic determinants, the basic elements of what reflection, as an ontological process, is. The rule that it constantly is following that defines this process is what it is. It's not an arbitrary process. It's a process that's bound by certain kinds of rules. So think about that as we walk through here now. So when he talks about positing reflection, that's the first determination of what this ontological process is. External reflection is going to be the second determination, and the third determination will be determining reflection itself. All those are trying to explicate what is the process of reflection as an ontological process. So if I lost people, are we okay? Make a little bit of sense? So we'll get back to essence itself in just a moment. That's what identity, difference, and contradiction will be about. But right now we're talking about the process that generates both essence and being a shine. So so in 346 he turns to this notion of positing reflection. Positing reflection. What is reflection in its most fundamental sense? Positive, or at least most elementary sense. Positive. Now, as we said, positing, Zetzen has two senses in Hegel, right? It means to make something explicit and to produce something. So Hegel's central claim about positing reflection is that to posit, reflective positing, to posit necessarily requires presupposing. Zetzen always has a Voraussetzen, presupposing, something that comes before it. So when you have a positing, you always have something that is presupposed, something that's taken for granted. So when you make something explicit, or when you produce something, you always are working from something to something else. That from that you're working from, that you're taking off from, this kind of reflection, is your presupposition. It's there already, it's taken as given. Now, as you're about to find out, that's not its ultimate status. But the first dimension, the first way of thinking about reflection is to think of it precisely in this way. Something is given, and then it reflects from it. It takes something for granted, has its presupposed, and it reflects from it. So it always presupposes, this form of reflection, positing reflection, always presupposes an antecedent given. An antecedent given, presupposes, antecedent given, from which it proceeds. Here's the way he says it on 347. This is the lower middle part of 347, 251 in the German, 347 in English. The second full paragraph down, the third sentence, reflection as the sublating of the negative. Reflection as the sublating of the negative. So right there, reflection as the sublating of the negative is the sublating of its other, of the immediacy. Because it is thus immediacy as a turning back, the coinciding of the negative with itself, it is equally the negation of the negative as negative, and so it is presupposing. He's taking, what does positing do? It always takes something for granted, negates it, and then it negates that negation. Right? It says, I took that for granted, but now I'm going to posit something from there. The movement of positing and reflection starts from nothing, starts from the immediate, starts from shine. In essence is what positing and reflection produces, so it's what it posits essence. It's the negation of that immediacy. It's the from the nothing to the nothing. In this sense, essence is positedness. This is the way he puts it on 347 again. This is a third of the way down the page. Positedness, Gazette sign, immediacy posit purely as determinateness or as self-reflecting. So to posit essence is thus to posit a positive being, and this positive being, essence, as its result, points back to the constitutive activity of positing that engendered it. Right? So essence always is indicating, hey, I'm positive. I was generated. What's presupposed is shine. So if you stopped at that moment, you would say, oh, wait a minute. This is an account of the pathway of knowledge. Right? Because we do this. We take for granted the world, right, in the broad sense. We take for granted the world, and then we reflect upon it, right, and we posit out of that certain essences. So, here's a table, there's another table. Oh, table, there's a thing called table, chairness. Oh, sorry, tableness, tableness, right, there's the essence. So we've done what? We've posited an essence. Well, we do that. Right? We do extract generalities from particulars. We do that all the time. That's not what he's talking about here. But it's the ontological underpinning that makes such extractions possible. Because if there wasn't something that we could get back to, in essence, then we wouldn't be able to make that generalization. We would be bound in a world of particulars, and we're not. We're able to say, table. Not that table, that table, that table, that. We can talk about table. That's already an abstraction. Right? Even that term is an abstraction. And the only way we can do that is if there is something like an essence that undergirds the possibility of that linguistic mental operation. Well, what is that? Reflection as an ontological movement does precisely that. It works from shine, which it presupposes. It won't always presuppose it, but at this level, it's presupposing it. It's taking it for granted. It's there already. It's placed it before for house sense, and right, it's there before the positing. And what we do then is we extract from it, posit from it, some generality, essence. That's what the reflective activity of positing reflection does. Now, if that makes a little bit of sense, then look at this passage where Hegel says, and this is what that means. Right? Because what he thinks it means is pretty strange given what we just said. What we just said, I think, sounds pretty plausible and intuitive. We do it, but it's not just us doing it, it's being itself that does this already. That's the claim, right? And what we do, we extract out generalities from particulars. Being's already doing that. Right? That's the claim, is that being inherent to itself is already making this kind of reflective operation in itself. But here's what he says. This is on page 348. 2 lines down from the top. Reflection thus finds. Everybody see where I'm at? Reflection thus finds. This is 252 in the German. He writes this, and just bear with me. Let's just walk our way through this passage and we'll unpack it. Reflection thus finds, findet, right? An immediate before, it, that it transcends and from which, aus, from out of it, it is the turning back. All right, that's positive reflection. It finds something, and then it reflects back from that, and turns back upon that, right? It says, here's what you want. But this turning back is only the presupposing of what was antecedently found. Okay, it only becomes a presupposition if I find something, right? It's not a presupposition unless I can find something. It's not presupposed unless I can actually find something that I can extract from it. So reflective activity, the constitutive ontological reflective activity, the moment of shine only becomes shine when the essence is found that undergirds the depth, the essential, that underlies the unessential, when it's posited as underlying, as the depth underlying the surface. That's when the surface, becomes surface, becomes the presupposition, the antecedently found. Then look at what Hegel does with that. This antecedent same term, right? This thing we found comes to be, Wert in German, comes to be only herein. Now that ought to stop you in your tracks, right? Because his claim there is that the presuppose is presupposed, but it only comes to be in the moment of being found as presupposed. No, Hegel, it's there, right? And we only recognize its status, right? That's what you're really trying to say. Its status is presupposed, only comes to be recognized as presupposed when we find where we're headed with it, which is the essence, right? So the reflection then reveals shine as its presupposition when it gets to posit the essence, and therefore the shine is presupposed. And now its status is presupposed, it comes to be that. That's not what Hegel's saying. But it's a plausible way of taking what he's saying. I just made it more, I domesticated Hegel, right? I said, oh, calm down, it makes sense. Right? It's like this. That's not what Hegel's saying. And the reason why I'm pushing this is because that's not where Hegel goes with this. Right? So it's very clear this is not what he thinks he's saying. What he thinks he's saying is, no, shine comes to be, not comes to be as shine, comes to be at all. Only insofar as essence is positive. So now this positing reflection that presupposes, the presupposition is actually engendered by the process itself. It's not there, given. He's using the given language, right? Find it's there. He's saying it's actually constituted, it's created, it's produced in that moment. This is not how we standardly understand reflection, even its most basic positing element. So he says, this antecedent comes to be only herein by being left behind, verlassen. Its immediacy is sublated immediacy. So it is what it is. It only is there. It's found. And it's constituted by virtue of the positing reflection itself. So Hegel is arguing here that positing reflection necessarily presupposes the immediacy of being from which it posits essence, and it takes its start, but it actually engenders that presupposition when it does that. It produces. So the positing is not just the positing of essence, which is what we thought. We thought that was all that was going on here, right? The given is a given, shine's there, we're going to posit essence. The operation of reflection is going to posit essence as that which is its depth for the surface, the essential for the unessential, so forth. And so we can tell the whole story. And that's there, absolutely, that's how you ought to understand positive reflection at the most basic level. But he's wanting to know, you know what that means though? Well, what? It means that the presupposition is the presupposition only for the essence. Right, it is. But that means that the presupposition only is insofar as it's tethered back to the essence. So this positing doesn't just go the way of positing the essence. It also posits being. It posits shine. It posits both moments. So positing is actually constitutive rather than secondary. It's constitutive of both moments, both the moment of essence and the moment of being. Now it sounds, though, like reflection stands outside of the moment of essence and the moment of being. It posits them both, but it stands beyond both of them. It's unto itself. It's a process that has two moments, but those two moments are products of it, posited products of it, that it then stands outside of. It's thus what he's about to call, what he now calls, external reflection. It's extrinsic or external to what? Both essence and being, both essence and shine. Now think about that for just a moment, because that's a really subtle point that Hegel's trying to make here. It's not the way we standardly think of external reflection. It's not the way we think of positive reflection. He is trying to say this. He's saying something is what it is by virtue of being presupposed, shine, the immediacy. And that immediacy reflects, it sublates itself, it reflects itself back into its essence. And that generates the essence. And in a common way, you want to say, we're done now, right? I mean, immediacy was given, shine's given, we live within the cave, right? And we want to find what, the truth of these things that are up here on the shadow puppets up on the wall. We want to find the truth. We want to get out of the cave, and we want to find the truth. Hegel's saying, yeah, that's the pathway of knowledge, but there's an ontological undergirding of that. So what does that do? That actually posits the essence that's out there that you'll eventually go find when you leave the cave. But our standard story says, well, that's because the stuff in the cave is all shadows, illusions, shine, guise. But Hegel's point is that, well, actually, the reflecting process that generates the essence is also what generates the shine. The light in the cave is the light coming from the sun. That's really where it's coming from. It's not how it works in Plato, by the way. It works that way on the divided line. It doesn't work that way on the cave. Similes are important. Right? They're also representational, so they're flawed. But that's another day. We'll talk about that. So here we have essence has been posited. You say, well, it's just one-sided. Positing reflection just posits the essence. It generates, it makes explicit, it generates the essence. But in generating the essence, it actually generates and makes explicit shine itself. It makes both moments explicit. It makes both moments products of itself. But then, here's the subtle point, reflection seems, as a process, seems to stand outside of both moments. It's not essence. It generates essence, but it's not essence. Reflection generates essence, but it's not essence. Reflection generates shine, but it's not shine. So now it stands exterior to both of those two moments. That's extrinsic reflection. So look at what he says about this. This is on 349. This is the third full paragraph down. But if one takes a closer look. At this point, we're 350 pages, almost the end of this book. You ought to recognize that when he says, when we take a closer look, things are about to change. Right? So there's a red flag there, right? That's the way. What it does, we don't. That's a mystery. But at least you're beginning to figure out Hegel's how he operates and how he writes. He says, but if one takes a closer look. So he says, I know this sounds like where we've gotten to is that the process is outside of its products. That the reflective, constitutive process of ontological process is outside of both shine and essence. It's exterior to both of them. Let's take a little closer look at that. Look what he says here in this paragraph. But if one takes a closer look at what external reflection does, it turns out that it is secondly means it's not just external. Secondly, the positing of the immediate, which thus becomes the negative or the determined. So it's not just the positing of that, it's not just the creation, the engendering of the immediate being as shine. But external reflection, is immediately also the sublating of this positing, because it gives rise to it, but also it's tethering it back to something else. So it produces it, but not as self-standing. Right? The shine can't stand on its own, being can't stand on its own as the surface. It has to be tethered to something else. So he says, but external reflection, is immediately also the sublating of this positing. For it, again, external reflection, presupposes, here's that same language again, the immediate. And he's literally saying in German, it posits the immediate beforehand, antecedently. In negating, it is the negating of its negating. So in negating it, it generates it. In becoming other, that's its negating. But it also negates that negation. It takes away its self-sufficiency. But thereby, it immediately is equally positing the subletting of the immediate, which it is this negative. And this negative, from which it seemed to start as from something alien, only is in this its beginning. It only generates itself there in that moment. So here's this point about, it may look like it's antecedently presupposed, it's actually engendered by the very process itself. He says, in this way, the immediate is not only in itself, or implicit, that is, for us or in external reflection, the same as what reflection is, so it's not external to it. Right? Being is not external to this process, it's engendered by it, but it doesn't just do a product and then stand separate from it. It is one moment of the process. But the immediate is posited as the same, for the immediate is determined by reflection as the negative of the latter, the negative of essence, or as its other. But it is reflection itself that negates this determining. So what is he saying there? He's saying that the process of reflection is not extrinsic to the moment of shine. It generates it, and as generating it, it is still with it in its generation of it. It doesn't become detached from it. It generates it, and then it doesn't stand over as a product separate from it. It doesn't build it to stand on its own. It doesn't create or posit, engender, shine, and then say, look at that. It's over there on its own, it's standing on its own. It can't. Shine is precisely negation. So it's dependency on something else. So the reflective process is still endemic to it. It's tying it back to what? The other moment that it's going to create. What is that? Essence. So it can't be extrinsic to that either. Can't be extrinsic to essence either, because essence isn't its product. Oh, look at that, it stands on its own. It engenders it and ties the two together. In other words, essence and shine are moments of the same process. They're endemic to that same process. That's when reflection is thought in its fullness, its completeness, its full determinacy, not as positing reflection, that's there, that's a moment of it, not as extrinsic reflection, yeah, that's the two moments separate from the process itself, but as the process of reflection engendering both moments is tied to one another. That's determining reflection. It's both the positing and the reflecting back. It posits and it ties both essence and shine together. Now, Hegel thinks at that point that he's told you as much as we can be told at this point about the logic, structure of reflection. But this is going to be a point we're going to come back to repeatedly in this book, as I've warned you, right? Constantly, Hegel is repeating this pattern at different varied levels. That is, he'll say, this is related to something else, and you'll realize, well, wait a minute, it's related to something else because it's actually transformed itself into that something else. It's not just something else that happened along. This is actually the othering of the first thing. So the first thing is what it is by virtue of othering itself in that second thing. And then, oh, well, then they're mutually implicatorily related to one another. Exactly right. And then Hegel wants to say, now what's the process that engendered both of them? Because that's always where he's going. He's going to, I'm trying to understand the generative moment. I think gives rise to the relata and their relations. He just did that. What are the relata? Essence and shine. Do they necessarily need one another? Yeah, you can't define one without the other. They can't be without the other. Well, what does that mean? Well, that they have a reflective process that engenders both of them. That reflective process doesn't just take one for granted and produce the other one, positing reflection. It doesn't stand outside of both of them and let them be on their own. They are not on their own. They are nothing to themselves. It's determining of both of them, determining reflection. So it engenders both of them. And it engenders them precisely as tied together. So far, so good? Now, here's what Hegel does next. I think this is really hard to get. Right? So I'm going to try to introduce it in as direct a way as I can, and then we'll walk our way through the details, the weeds of it, and try to make sense of those. Here's the most direct way I know to put it. He next starts talking about, so after he talks about determining reflection, the next chapter is called The Essentialities or the Determinations of Reflection. And here's where he talks about identity, difference, and contradiction. And he talks about the laws, right? The laws of each. Law of identity, laws of difference, laws of contradiction. And, you know, you want to say, when you first look at those, oh, finally, in a book about logic, we're talking about some logical principles here. You know, the logic of identity, the logic of difference, you know, we're starting a contradiction. Except it sounds like he violates the principle of non-contradiction or something, right? Okay, but at least he's talking logic to us. What is this about? What are the essentialities? What is an essentiality? I mean, that ought to be your first question. What the hell is an essentiality? It's not an essence. Right? It's not an essence. I mean, if he wanted to say essence, he knows the word. He would say essence. But he doesn't. He says essentialities. Wesenheit. The hell is that? Wesenheit. What's that? So what I submit to you he's doing in this discussion is he's saying, okay, look, I've shown you, thus far, I've shown you this, haven't I? I've shown you that shine and essence are necessarily related. You can't have one without the other. No shine without essence, no essence without shine. And that the process that engenders both of them and thereby ties them together to one another is called reflection. So I've shown you that. And I've shown you that that reflection, that reflective ontological process, has a logic to it. That logic to it is ultimately understood as determining reflection. And what determining reflection means is that it engenders both moments. It engenders both essence and shine, and it engenders them, and they are engendered as moments of it. It doesn't stand separate from them. It is what engenders both of them, and is what they are. So far, so good. And what he says, I'm paraphrasing massively, on 353, is that now we need to look at what makes an essence an essence. What makes an essence an essence. So we've talked about the positing of shine, we talked about the positing of essence, and we talked about how they're mutually implicatory of one another, and right, we've got all that. So let's now set aside shine, and let's look at the essence side of this. We're going to focus on those for just a moment. The essence side of things. We have not even got an essence, let's be clear, right? There's no essence of human, no essence of table, none of that crap. Not a bit of it. It's just essence as such. What is an essence as such? What is essence, not and? What is essence as such? Here he's going to lay out what I think it's best to understand as the laws of essence formation. The law, that's what the essentialities are. They're the laws, the rules of essence formation. In other words, what are the rules for defining what an essence is? What are the rules for defining what an essence is? Now, I think the first one's pretty easy to get. Right? To be an essence is to be an identity. It's to be the same as itself. So to be an essence is to be an identity. Okay. He's going to argue, we'll look at the argument, but let me just give you the sort of schematic overview before we look at the details. He's going to argue that to be an identity, an essence, he's not talking about shine anymore, although he's going to be referring to it here, but not talking about it directly. To be an essence is to be an identity, but to be an identity means you're not difference. You're not otherness. You're not difference itself. So we can posit them, we can distinguish between identity, that's what an essence is, and difference, which is everything that's what the identity is not. But that means, you know where this is going, you can't have an identity without relationship to difference. You can't be an identity. An essence can't be what it is. Can't be identical, can't be the same as itself, unless it's not the same as itself. Or at least bears a relationship to that which is other than it. Bears a relationship to that which is other than it. Which is, difference. Well, what do we mean by difference, Hegel says? Well, we mean by difference initially diversity, variety. Some things are different than other things. They're different in one respect, they're different in other respects. They are not the same as one another. That's what we mean by difference. This is Leibniz's law of diversity, by the way. No two things are exactly the same. They're different in this respect, different in that respect, same in this respect, same in that respect. And so Hegel goes through and says, right, that's variety, that's Verschiedenheit in German, that's difference. The other term he'll use for this is Mannigfaltigkeit. Right? Translate that as manifold, that's the way we translate it in Kant. So the diverse and the manifold, he'll use those interchangeably, but for your Deleuze people out there, that's also multiplicity. Mannigfaltigkeit is multiplicity. So you can say, well, the identity is that which is other than the multiple, the manifold, the diverse, the variety. And then Hegel says, right, it's other than it. But then it bears a relationship to it. Identity bears a relationship. It is what it is. There is identity only in relationship to difference. Well, what kind of difference? Well, diversity is where we start. But if you look at diversity, now he just focuses then on difference, leaves the identity side back, waiting for a moment. Let's just look at diversity. Is diversity truly multiplicity? And his claim is that no, actually it proves out to be opposition. Why? Because there's comparison at work in them. Vergleichen. There's comparison at work going. They're like in some ways, they're different in other ways. Now that's not us doing the comparative, right? Because again, that's a work of reflection. So that's not us doing it. That's being doing it. So being is doing reflecting, doing comparative work within itself. Things are similar, things are different. Now here we're back at the level of Schein, because here we're talking about things as they are, they're existing. We're not talking about the essence yet. Yet we find things are similar and dissimilar, like, gleich, unlike, ungleich. If they're similar in some ways and dissimilar in other ways, then they're opposed, similar and dissimilar, like and dislike. They're positive and negative attributes. And Hegel's going to argue if they're opposed and they're dependent on one another, then identity has to be thought of as the same as itself because it's not the same as itself. It is itself because it's not itself. In other words, to be in essence is to be in contradiction with itself. Identity is necessarily contradiction. That's the argument. That's an overview of the argument. We'll do the details. That's an overview of the argument. Now, he will draw things from that, from the claim that essences to be essences have to be identities, but to be identities, they have to be other than difference, but if they're other than difference, then they have to be other than this thing that they're actually dependent on. That identities can't be maintained over against difference, that difference defines identity, and if difference defines identity, then how does it define it? It defines it as diversity. It's not that, it's not diversity. But then diversity actually proves out to be oppositional. But if it's oppositional, then identity proves out to be what? One of the poles of that opposition. And then it proves out to be not just an extrinsic relationship between two moments. It proves out to be that identity can be itself only because it's incorporated difference within itself. It's integrated difference within itself. That's the only way in which identity can be identity. But that means that it's both itself, identical to itself, and not itself. It's A and not A. Hegel's quite willing to embrace that. That's contradiction. It's not propositional contradiction, it's ontological contradiction. They're not the same thing. So Hegel wants to say, look, to be an essence is to be an identity, but to be an identity is to necessarily be a contradiction, to be itself and to not be itself. And then here's what he draws from that. And then this claim, and then we'll go back and actually look at, reconstruct how he does this. If it's a contradiction, if it's self and it's other than itself, then it's necessarily a ground. Or better said, it's grounding. Because it others itself and issues forth back into essence, issues forth into Schein. Then Schein's no longer Schein, it's the appearance of the essence. And here's why essences must appear. Essences must appear for Hegel because essences are necessarily in contradiction with themselves. And they're in contradiction with themselves because they're identities that can't but incorporate difference within themselves. Difference is negation, and incorporated into the very core of what it is to be an identity. As a general scheme makes a little bit of sense, at least the pathway. Lots of crazy stuff to go there, but that's the basic move. Let's walk our way through it. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with identity because Hegel doesn't spend a lot of time with identity. He says A equals A, right? That's what an essence is. An essence is the same as itself, except it can't be. That's literally how he works from it, right? So an essence is what is set down as self-identical. That's what reflection posits. It posits an identity. But to be identical, to be A equals A, to be the same as itself, such a posited essence must exclude, this is the first move, right? Must exclude all that which is non-identical, that which is different from it. So essence must set itself as distinct from all that it's not. What is it not? Not Schein. It's the depth over against the surface. That's what it is not. So all that is difference. Hence, to be an identity, an essence, remember these are the laws of identity formation. What is it to be an essence? Minimally, it means you've got to be an identity. But how are you an identity? By setting aside, excluding everything that's different as other. It does not include non-identity. Now we're about to find out that that's precisely what it does include. It has to. But initially, it can't include non-identity, difference. And Hegel shows that the nature of this relationship between identity and difference cannot be merely extrinsic. Cannot be merely extrinsic. And that's what he thinks diversity is, right? Diversity is a way of thinking about identity is related to difference, where difference is, all these diverse, varied moments of shine. It's everything else, right? Other than the identity we can posit over against it. That would be an extrinsic relationship. But he also says it can't be a hybrid moment of intrinsic and extrinsic determination. That's what opposition is going to be. It's got to be immanent. Difference has got to be immanent to, non-identity has got to be immanent to identity itself. Now, how does this work? Well, Hegel's going to use three terms that are important here, so let me just define them and then we'll walk our way through them. The three terms, I've already mentioned them, are diversity, opposition, and contradiction. Verschiedenheit, Gegensatz, and Widerspruch. So let me just define each one of those and then let's walk our way from one to the next. This is literally how Hegel operates here. Right? He says, let's start off, so if we're going to talk about identity as that which excludes everything that's not identical, then let's go to the non-identical. What is the non-identical? And the first determination of the non-identical is it's the various, the variety, the diverse. That's what it is. It's Verschiedenheit. So he calls this indifferent difference. Indifferent difference. It's difference that is not determined by anything itself or by anything else. Identity here, if there is any identity here, it's in the likeness, the similarity, the Gleichheit. And difference, the unlikeness, the dissimilarity, the Ungleichheit. Those are extrinsically related to one another here. And they're indifferent to one another. So in the world of shine, in the world of being, you can find things that are similar and things that are dissimilar, but they don't have anything to do with one another. That's what diversity is. There's many different things here. And in some respects, they're like one another, in some respects, they're unlike one another. You can find those aspects of things. But it doesn't make a hill of beans difference to, that's my language, not Hegel's, hill of beans difference to the actual being, shine itself. So Hegel will say identity and difference here, in the form of similarity, identity, similarity, and difference, dissimilarity, have an extrinsic relationship here. They don't matter to each other. They're there, but you can find them purely by comparison. So comparison comes along, sounds like it's purely either positing reflection or extrinsic reflection. It takes the given for granted, and then it posits the similarities you can have and the dissimilarities you can have out of it. We know the problems with that already, right? Presuppose is not really standing on its own. It's not really found there on its own. We'll come back to that. So that's the first form of non-identity, difference, diversity. The second form is opposition, Gegensatz. How do you get from one to the other? We'll talk about. But the second form is Gegensatz, opposition. Here you have both a moment of identity and difference. He calls them here positive and negative, where they stand in a relation of mutual dependence upon one another. They are moments of one relation. So the difference here is not indifferent. It's a difference that makes a difference. But it's still extrinsic to the self-relation of each. The moment of the positive is related to the moment of the negative, but they stand independent of one another. They bear a relationship, but they are not mutually defining of one another. You can't have one without the other, but they are not infused in the other yet. So you don't have contradiction. The positive is positive, the negative is negative, and they don't really interact directly. They just, they're standing over against one another. So that's what I would call a hybrid relation. They're both extrinsic to one another, but they're intrinsic. You need the one and the other. You can't define the positive without the negative, negative without the positive. But the negative and the positive are not definitive of themselves in terms of the other. So the positive is not definitive of the negative internally. The negative is not definitive of the positive internally. Yeah. Then contradiction. Contradiction is immanent difference, intrinsic difference. This is where identity and difference are what they are, only in and through, by virtue of being related to the other. So this isn't positive and negative. This is where to be positive, to be the identity, is to have the negative literally ingrained into, incorporated into positivity itself. But that means it's both itself and not itself at the same time. It is itself by virtue of not being itself. So here's Hegel doing this fine-grained analysis again, right? He's saying, first you have diversity, then diversity shows up at best, identity and difference at best shows up there in terms of similarity and dissimilarity. Then you realize, wait a minute, similarity and dissimilarity are actually positivity and negativity. And that means they're related to one another, but they're not infused into one another, they're not integrated, they're not incorporated into one another. They just bear a relationship to one another. You can't have the similar without the dissimilar, you can't have the positive without the negative. What's the big deal? And then you have to realize that, wait a minute, no, positive is actually defined by having the negative incorporated into it. The negative is defined by having the positive incorporated into it. It's both moments are now positive and negative in themselves. They are themselves, positive, negative. They're not themselves, negative, positive. They are therefore in contradiction with themselves. They are themselves, reflected into themselves by being reflected into the other. Hegel puts it. Their self-subsistence is defined by their including or containing their opposite within themselves. All right. There's three kinds of difference. Yes? Diversity, opposition, contradiction. The difference between diversity and contradiction is the other is incorporated into identity. Difference is incorporated into identity itself, such that identity is what it is by not being what it is. That's contradiction. Opposition is the harder one to get, right? In diversity, you don't have any of that, right? Diversity is just identity and difference. Yeah, they're both there. Similarity and dissimilarity, what's the big deal? The hard one is the opposition, because the oppositional structure says, no, you can't have one without the other. They've not infected each other yet, but they bear a relation. The relation is at once extrinsic, right? They both are there, but they're not integrated into the other. But it's also intrinsic a bit. It's a hybrid. So they bear a relationship to one another. That's what makes the positive the negative the negative. Negative is their relational moment to each other. But then you realize, well, wait a minute, the positive can't be the positive without the negative can't be the negative without the positive. That means that that's not an extrinsic relation, that's an intrinsic relation. But that means that both the positive and the negative are what they are by virtue of not being what they are. They're in contradiction. Necessarily so. And Hegel's argument is that diversity necessarily entails contradiction. Diversity necessarily and imminently entails contradiction. So how does that work? Well, let's take it this way. Why does diversity entail opposition? Let's deal with that first. Then why does opposition necessarily entail contradiction? Let's build it up that way. So let's start with diversity. So remember, where Hegel's starting here is to say, to be an identity is to be what an essence is. But to be an identity is to exclude all that is non-identical. Well, what is the non-identical? So it's difference. Well, what is difference? Difference is minimally defined as diversity. So here's where we start. So in diversity, identity and difference stand in indifference with respect to one another. This indifferent relation, Hegel says, is the reflective act of comparison, vergleichen. Right? We see we compare things. Ontologically, things are compared, right? We do it because it's possible to do it, because already within being, there is this comparison going on. And this comparison does what? Two concepts are identified with one another, and as such they, what is identical and what is different, are alike, they're similar in certain ways. Right? So things are similar to one another in certain ways. But the same act of comparison also differentiates things. To say that they're alike in some ways is to say they're different in others. So you're forging an identity statement, right? They're alike, they're similar in this way, but you're also formulating at the exact same time a different statement. They're dissimilar in these other ways. So that's an external act of comparison, right? Comparison is external. Hegel says on 364, this is the second line up from the bottom, it's the negative unity of both, the comparison is the negative unity of both, the like and the unlike. 364 and 365, right? He says, This negative unity is initially beyond. There's that language back from the logic of being. It's beyond. It's yenzens. The compared. It's beyond that the two moments that are being compared, similar and the dissimilar. And also beyond the moments of the comparison. Right? Sorry. It's beyond the realm of shine. It's beyond the moments that you're extracting from shine. The moments of similar and dissimilarity. And he says, it sounds like it's here a subjective operation, subjective doing, falling outside them. Now think about that for just a moment. Because that's a sensible point, right? You need these moments where you go like, I think I just got what Hegel was saying. All Hegel is saying is that what's going on here at the level of reflection, ontologically, is these things are they're comparable in certain ways, and they're uncomparable in other ways, right? They're alike in certain ways, they're unlike in other ways. That's all he's saying. And no one, right, would say, oh, well, the comparison is really integral to the diversity itself. No, it's something you do with the diversity. The diversity is, presupposed, given, and you extract out. That's why it looks like a subjective activity. You extract out the similarity and the dissimilarity from them, but it's not. Come on, it's not in them. It's not in the shine. I mean, the diverse is the shine, right? But we find the similarities and dissimilarities. It doesn't matter one bit to the shine that it has those similarities and dissimilarities. But he says, but those two moments, the similarity and dissimilarity, the likeness and the unlikeness, those are actually a negative unity. We're finding what makes up the diverse through this negative unity of what makes them similar to one another, what makes them dissimilar to one another. That, Hegel says, as we've already seen him argue, means that the presupposed is not given. The presupposed shine is not given. And we're just, extracting out its similarities and dissimilarities. No, the negative unity means that's actually how the diverse is constituted as diverse. Likeness and unlikeness are what they are by virtue of the contrast posited between them. It is what they are, and it is by virtue of which they are. It's that by virtue of which they are. Identity and difference thus stand in a relation which is each opposed to the other and is determined or marked out by that opposition. So think about this, right? This goes back to is it presupposed or is it generated by the very positing itself? Here we've got two moments, similarity and dissimilarity. They look to be extrinsic to the given, something that's generated out of the act of comparison, all of which looks to be posited as the essence over against the shine, the presupposed. But as we know, the presupposed becomes itself through that very activity. It's not revealed just as presupposed, what we took for granted to get these things generated out of them. It comes to be what it is. So now those two moments of similarity and dissimilarity turn out to be the positive and negative poles that define shine as what it is. Here's what he says on 364, right in the middle of the page. Take a look on 364. Right in the middle of page 364, the third full paragraph down, because of the separation from each other, they sublate themselves. Everybody see that? Look at the next sentence down. Precisely that which should save them from contradiction and disillusion, namely that something is like another in one respect but is unlike it in another, precisely this keeping of likeness and unlikeness apart, they're extrinsic, is their destruction. That's why they can't be kept apart. That's why they can't be held extrinsic. For both are determinations of difference. They are relations to one another, the one being what the other is not. Like is not unlike, unlike is not like. Seems a trivial point, but it's incredibly important. They are the positive and negative poles of one another. And both essentially have this relation and have no meaning outside of it. As determinations of difference, each is what it is as differentiated from its other. Look down on the bottom of page 364, this is 269 still in the German. This negative unity, see the last two lines on 364? This negative unity. This negative unity transcends at first what is compared as well as the moments of the comparing. He's telling you it can't be held extrinsic. It transcends the moment of being held out separate from them as a subjective operation that falls outside them. That's not what it is. But the result is that this unity is in fact the nature of likeness and unlikeness themselves. Even the independent viewpoint that each of these is rather the self-relation that sublates their distinctness, and so too themselves. That allows Hegel to make this conclusion. Look at the bottom of, just before the remark. This is in the second full paragraph down on 365, 270 in the German. The merely diverse thus passes over. It's right in the middle of that paragraph, just after the hyphen. The merely diverse thus passes over through the positiveness into negative reflection. The diverse is difference that is merely positive, hence a difference that is no difference, hence a negation that negates itself within. Likeness and unlikeness themselves, the positiveness, thus returns through indifference or through implicitly existing reflection back into negative unity with themselves, into the reflection that is the implicit difference of likeness and unlikeness. Diversity, the indifferent sides of which are just as much simply and solely moments of a negative unity, is opposition. They look like they're extrinsic differences that don't make any difference. They're indifferent. You can take them this way, take them that way. They're similar in this way and similar in that way. But actually, they are constitutive of what the shine is. It's similar in these ways, dissimilar in those. But that means it's positively this and negatively that. And those are not actually extrinsic determinations. Those are intrinsic determinations of what those things are. It's the intrinsic determinations of what it is to be. So that means diversity can't just be diversity. Diversity sounds like something, and is something, that we ascribe to the multitude of shine. We say it's like in this way, it's unlike in the other ways. But like and unlike prove out to work differently than that and show that the comparing activity is not our comparing activity, it's a comparing activity that's intrinsic to being itself. And that means that similarity and dissimilarity, likeness and unlikeness, are the positive and negative poles of shine itself. Difference is not diversity. Diversity is necessarily oppositional. We've got one more step to go. Here's Hegel's argument. They're oppositional, fine. So now you've got the positive moment, they're similar, the negative moment, they're dissimilar, and you say, well, you know, that's not our ascription of the way in which being operates. What it exudes and what it exemplifies, right? It's endemic to being itself. Right? So it's got a positive moment, identity, similarity. It's got a negative moment, difference and dissimilarity. And that's just, the nature of reality. So what's the big deal about that? Hegel's claim is that, you can't just recognize that there is no similarity without dissimilarity. There is no positivity without negativity. There's no negativity without positivity. They are mutually implicative of one another. Yes. That's what he's arguing to at this point. And he's happy, he's not fully happy, but he's happy if you'll just see that, the truth of that. Because that's an important stage along the way, to see that. But if you buy that, he thinks you ought to buy that, then you have to buy what follows from that necessarily. What follows from that necessarily is positivity doesn't just bear a relationship to negativity, and negativity doesn't just bear a relationship to positivity. Positivity and negativity are what they are by virtue of not what they are. Positivity is what it is by virtue of negativity. It doesn't just bear a relationship to it. Oh yeah, I'm this, and one of the many things I do is also have a relationship to negativity. And negativity is like, yeah, I'm all whole into myself, and I've got everything taken care of. Oh, by the way, I also have a relationship to positivity. It's not secondary to them. Their relationship is endemic to both of them. If it's endemic to both of them, then there is no positivity without negativity. But that means that negativity isn't just one relationship among others that positivity has. It's the defining relationship that makes positivity what it is. That works the reverse. Negativity is what it is by virtue of positivity. But that means that the negative is itself, negative, and positive. It's itself and not itself. And that's true of the positive as well. It is itself and it's not itself. It's in contradiction. It's both A and not A. Hegel's quite happy to say it like that. Identity then is what? Identity is always contradiction, because it bears a relationship to that which it is not, which it can't render as merely secondary. It can't say, oh, I have an identity, and yeah, because I have this identity, an essence has an identity, then oh yeah, it has a bunch of things that it's related to. The bunch of things that it's related to, what's the not its identity, is what makes its identity what it is. It's both its identity, and by virtue of, it is that identity by virtue of not being those things. So that notness, that negation, is an intrinsic negation, not an extrinsic negation. And if it's an intrinsic negation, then it means it's both itself by not being itself. It's itself by not being itself. It's at one and the same time. The only way it can be A equals A is that A is not A. Hegel loves the formulation of that, right? He thinks that shows the operation of negation, which is really what this is all about. Notice, right? Is negation out there and we extract essences from it, or is negation intrinsic to essence itself? And he's just made an argument that said there is no identity, there are no essences, without negation being intrinsic to the essence itself. And that's why essence is contradiction. Here's the way he puts it. So take a look at it. Take a look on 374. About halfway down the page, it's 279, the German paragraph that begins, one is the positive, the other the negative. Everybody see where I'm at? Look at the second sentence there. Each has indifferent self-subsistence for itself. So he's talking about the positive and negative. They have indifferent self-subsistence for itself by virtue of having the reference, the relation to its other moment within it. That's the key. Opposition doesn't have the other moment within it. It bears a relationship to it. Yeah, the positive is not the negative is not the positive. Okay, fine. But Hegel's point is that the entailment of that is that there is no positivity without negativity. There is no negativity without positivity. And that means that it doesn't just bear a relation to its other, that otherness is intrinsic to it. It's within it, as he says here. Each moment is thus the whole self-contained opposition. Each moment. Positivity has the whole opposition built into it. It's both positive and negative. The negative is both moments, positive and negative, built into it. Notice, we start off with just similarity and dissimilarity. Hegel is saying, similarity and dissimilarity sound like ascriptions that we make about things. They're not. They're the essence of things. As this whole, he says, each moment is self-mediated through its other and contains this other. Oppositional relationships bear the relation. They don't contain the other. But Hegel's saying, but they can't not contain the other. But it is also self-mediated through the non-being of its other, and is therefore a unity existing for itself and excluding the other from itself. It's both itself and not itself. It's literally what he just said. It's itself and not itself at the same time. Look on the fourth full paragraph down, 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, next paragraph down. He writes this: since the self-subsisting determination of reflection excludes the other in the same respect as it contains it, excludes it and it contains it at the same time. It is it and not it at the same time. And is self-subsisting for precisely this reason. It is what it is by virtue of this. In its self-subsistence, the determination excludes its own self-subsistence from itself. Now look, I know I'm infected with a disease called, I like to read Hegel, but that's not a bad encapsulation of contradiction, right? Listen to it again. In its self-subsistence, the determination excludes its own self-subsistence from itself. In being itself, self-subsistence, it necessarily includes its own non-self-subsistence. It is itself by not being itself. For this self-subsistence consists in that it contains the determination that is other than it in itself and does not refer to anything external for just this reason, but no less immediately in that it is itself, it excludes from itself the determination that negates it. And so it is contradiction. Hegel just says, I know this drives Aristotelian nuts, but this is not about that. That's propositional contradiction. This is ontological contradiction. This is saying something is what it is by virtue of not being what it is. Hegel's claim is that that's not an incidental claim. Some things are like this. He's saying this is true about the nature of reality as such. Just like he said, everything's a nodal line. All essences are necessarily themselves by not being themselves. Every essence, if this is the laws of the formation, the essentialities are the laws of the formation of essences, then to be an essence is to be an identity, but to be an identity is necessarily to be contradiction. Because it bears a relationship to difference, where that relationship to difference is not incidental to it, it's endemic to it, it's intrinsic to it. Therefore, it is itself because it bears within it non-identity. To be an identity is to be non-identity. To be A is to be not A. He says on 375, the paragraph that comes over from 374, the ending of that paragraph just after the hyphen. They constitute determining reflection as exclusive, for the excluding is one act of distinguishing, and each of the distinguished beings as exclusive is itself the whole act of excluding. So the positive and the negative moments, each incorporates that moment of exclusion. And so each excludes itself internally. Notice, it doesn't exclude the other. It does do that, but it doesn't just do that. It also excludes itself internally. Now, at that moment, you want to say, okay, Hegel, I think you've just told me that in order for an essence to be an essence, it has to be an identity. And I love that, because that goes along with my standard understanding of what an essence is supposed to be. An essence is supposed to be the set of properties that make something what it is, and they're supposed to be identical with one another. That makes some sense. And that means they have to exclude all the things they're not. We're good. It's a generality, or it's a class, or whatever it is. It's an essence in that sense. It's a form, right? And it has a bunch of different, people talking about it, instantiations. They all participate in it in some way. All grand and glorious. We're all wonderful about this, right? It's all good. But here's the problem with that, Hegel's saying. You can't just exclude them and think you're done with the difference. You can't say, essence is different than shine. And sure, shine's got some things that are similar and got some things that are dissimilar, but we can extract out the similarities. And we can say, we're going to posit those as the essence. That's the identity. All that dissimilarity will have to stay over there in the sphere of shine, and never the twain shall meet. Hegel says, I'm sorry, did you not get the point? You can't have an identity without a reference to something that is non-identical. So this non-identity is not going to sit over there and go, oh, okay. Whatever you think. If you want to have an identity over there, then no problem. We'll be over here. We'll have nothing to say about that. Hegel's point is that, actually, no. If you're going to bear that relationship, then that relationship is either going to be extrinsic or intrinsic. And his argument is that it can't just be extrinsic. The similarity, dissimilarity structure of diversity is not sufficient to capture what those two moments are actually about. Those two moments are necessarily implicatory of one another. That's the positive and the negative. And if they're the positive and the negative, then they actually bear the other one inside themselves. They contain the other in themselves. Now that'll have repercussions on the shine side of things. We'll get to those. But for the moment, we'll stay with the essence side of things. And what that means is that in essence, to be an identity has to be non-identical. Has to be itself and not be itself at the same time. But it must, as he says, not only exclude the other, but exclude itself. That's contradiction. So to be in essence is to be self-contradictory. It is itself, in essence, is itself by virtue of being in contradiction with itself. To be identical with itself through the negation, not of an other, which is what every time we talked about this in the logic of being, we said, well, there's something in other. There's reality and negation. There's discreteness and continuity. We always talked about them in relationship to one another. And those were incredibly important moments and incredibly important things to say. But in the logic of essence, identity doesn't bear a relationship to the non-identical. It does. But it doesn't just bear a relationship to the non-identical. The non-identical, the negation, is born within it. It doesn't have a relationship, it's defined by that relationship. But that means that it is itself by not being itself. It is, as he says, it excludes itself internally. It's in self-contradiction. Now, if you take a look on 377, I know we're coming down to the end here, so let me just point this out. We'll come back and treat this in more detail next time. On 376 to 377, you either think one of two things. Right? You may think others, but at least one of two things. You either think what Hegel does here is brilliant, right? Very insightful, and my God, he's found something that how else would anybody else find this? Right? Or he's performed a trick, a linguistic trick. Because here's what he says. I'm going to paraphrase it, and then we'll come back and look in detail at it next time. He says, as he says on 376, 2, contradiction resolves itself. Contradiction resolves itself. And you want to say, do you know how contradiction works? Contradictions don't resolve themselves. Contradictions destroy themselves. We just said that something is what it is because it internally undermines itself. It excludes itself internally. Well, that means it destroys itself. It is, as Hegel's about to call it, null. Well, there's a phrase in German he's about to work with. When something destroys itself, zugrunde gehen, it goes to the ground. Well, what that standardly means is it dissipates, it falls apart, it collapses, it dies. Right? That's what the ground is there, right? You're going to the ground means you literally are being buried. You go back to the earth from which you're returning back to the earth from which you came. So zugrunde gehen, you're going back to the earth, you're going back to the ground. You are falling apart, you are dissipated. And Hegel wants to say, right, that's exactly what's happening. They are falling apart. So an essence is in contradiction with itself, and because it's in contradiction with itself, it destroys itself. It destroys its internal integrity. It can't be itself. So, it destroys itself. It dies. Something that's in contradiction with itself, it destroys itself. It's null. As he says at one point here, they fate themselves to founder. Right? They're destined to founder. Their determination, Bestimmung, right? Their fate, their destiny, is to founder, to collapse. That's the nature of them. Essences can't be what they... So you want to say, here we go. I'm a novelist. I knew this was going to happen. Once you get to an essence, you can show that it's self-contradictory. It's obliterated. It's gone. No essences. There you go. Hegel says, right. That's what he does. Except that negation is also generative. It's destructive. Absolutely, it's destructive. That means essences can't be essences unto themselves. That's what it means. An essence can't be an essence unto itself. The world, the domain of essence, is not a world that's intact unto itself. It collapses. But in collapsing, it becomes the ground of something else. Something that it then engenders. It's the ground for the ground dead. Zugrunde gehen, it goes to the ground, it becomes the ground. So that's the way Hegel reads that line. It dissolves, right, it collapses, right, it destroys itself, it's in contradiction with itself, right. But that doesn't mean it destroys itself. You're a little too quick there, he's saying. Right? You're trigger happy, right? You saw the contradiction, you thought, the thing imploded on itself, it's gone, it's done. We close up the book, no more essence. And Hegel says, right, it does do that, but negation is not always destructive, or at least it's not completely destructive. It's also determinative, it's also generative, it's absolute, and that means it engenders something beyond it, and that's what happens here. Essences, because they're self-contradictory, not because they're pristine and don't have any contradiction, but precisely because they're contradictions, are necessarily grounds of that which they ground. So the grounding relationship between essence and shine, essence and being, comes from this. And this is why essences must appear. Essences must appear because they're necessarily self-contradictory, and therefore they must other themselves. And the way they other themselves is by being the ground, grounded. That's the ground of what used to be called being, what we a few minutes ago called shine, but now we must call it, because it's the expression of the essence, Erschein, the appearance essence. Enough of that, I've got to run. Thank you for being patient with me. Let's hold your questions. I know you'll have 1,000 of them, you should, ought. We'll talk about those next week. We'll start class with that discussion of difference and pick it up from there. All right, thank you guys, I appreciate it.